and a lot of people resonated with it. It did extremely well. And down the bottom, I just wrote, I'm thinking about running a course on this. If anyone's interested, let me know. And the comments just went crazy. And I thought, okay, interesting. Like there's definitely demand for this. A lot of us think, particularly in UX research, that we're really sort of empathetic operators and we're really people, and that's gonna be enough.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the UX Minds podcast. Have you ever wondered how culture can affect UX research? Well, you're just in the right place because today's guest is going to delve right into that subject. Yes, today's guest is Ruby Pryor. She's the founder of Rex, a UX research consultancy firm based in Southeast Asia. Now, she's going to discuss her background, how she entered the field, and also the reasons behind why she traveled and how that has enriched her experiences and also leveled up her UX research. So sit back, enjoy, and let's get into today's interview with the amazing Ruby Pryor. Okay, yeah, so Ruby, I'm really happy to have you here. It's been a while that I've been wanting to get you onto this podcast, so I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
No problem. So yeah, I suppose we'll start at the most natural point, a little bit of an introduction. So I've already obviously introduced you and kind of your background, but would you like to go into a bit more detail as to, how you've arrived to the point you are now in your life?
Wow, what a question to start. Sure. So currently I'm the founder of a strategic design and UX research consulting firm called Rex. Okay. I started this firm just over a year ago. Yeah, I think it's only been a kind of like 14 months, something like that. But it's been a pretty amazing adventure, I would say, going into the world of entrepreneurship. It's the first time I've ever dabbled in anything like this. I'm definitely one of those people who's like running lemonade stands when they were a kid or anything like that. I've really never done anything, never had an online store, never done anything until I like started this business. It was in with a bang.
You went straight in the top.
Yeah. It's been a really phenomenal experience. So that's me now. I'm based in Bangkok, Thailand. Prior to living here, I lived in Singapore for 5.5 years. And when I lived in Singapore, I started my company there. But prior to that, I worked as an in-house UX researcher at Grab. Grab calls itself Southeast Asia's super app. So they do rideshare, kind of like Uber. They also do a financial component to it as well. So they have lots of different services. So I worked there for a little bit under 2 years. And then prior to that, I actually worked in management consulting. So I worked at Boston Consulting Group in Singapore. And then back in Melbourne, Australia, where I'm from originally, I worked at a company called I worked at a company called Nous Group, doing management consulting there. My kind of path to being an in-house UX researcher took a long time. Like I'm not someone that started out their career in that field. It's been a meandering path to get there, crossing a few countries and all. But yeah, that's like at a high level, my career journey, I guess.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I've noticed just interviewing the people that I've interviewed that not many people start off as a UX researcher, kind of the path to enter the field, because it is, being defined as a UX researcher is kind of new from what I've seen since I've been in the field. So yeah, it's always interesting to find out people's backgrounds and how they ended up to being UX researchers. It's always an interesting comparison between everybody's background and stuff. That's super cool. And thanks for sharing your background as well. So I just wondered, just out of personal curiosity, what made you want to travel? So obviously you're from Melbourne. Was it career, or did you want to change, or what was the reason for that?
Oh, I wanted to change for sure. I think I really had my first experience sort of living overseas when I was at university. So I did a semester abroad where I lived in Spain. So I lived in Salamanca, which is a couple of hours outside of Madrid.
Not far from me, actually.
Loved it. It was such an amazing experience. Salamanca is so beautiful as a
Mm.
town. It's a real student town.
Is
The
it on
the
the
architecture
coast?
is amazing. It's inland still. So
Okay.
it's about 2 to 3 hours west of Madrid, so heading towards Portugal. So it's pretty
Okay.
close to the border with Portugal. And the university there is super old. It's like nearly 1,000 years old. There's a
Wow.
cathedral there that's about the same age. Like it was really, really special time of my life.
Mm.
So always had wanted to go overseas again at some
Yeah.
point, but it's really hard to make a
Mm.
move overseas. I think there's
Yeah.
always a million reasons not to do it. It's never
Mm.
the right time. It's
Yeah.
logistically very difficult. It can be actually really expensive to do as
Yeah.
well. For me personally, it involved a period of time of not working because I
Okay.
quit my job in Australia and then got a new job overseas. There can also be really expensive like fees involved with things like visas. You
Yeah.
might have to be renting a new country that's really expensive. You might be in a
Mm.
hotel for a couple of weeks. Like if you're not being moved and relocated through work,
It's a
it's a
tough
really
one.
difficult thing like to self-initiate.
Yeah.
So it honestly kind of never felt like the right time, but eventually we got the push we needed when our the landlord of the place we were renting in Melbourne was like, "We're going to sell the place, so you have to
Okay.
leave."
Gave you
And exactly, exactly. So it gave a real push. Like we lived in a really beautiful suburb in Melbourne called Richmond, and we just loved it. And we thought, I don't know if we can do any better than this in Melbourne. Maybe let's go overseas. And my partner and I were really keen to explore Asia. So we looked at
Mm.
Hong Kong and we also looked at Singapore and ended up settling in Singapore. My
Mm.
original plan was to live there for like 2 to 3 years and it
Yeah.
turned into 5.5. But
Amazing though.
look, it was tough. I think moving
Mm.
overseas is always difficult. I
Yeah.
think for me there was definite culture shock,
Yeah.
living in a total like in a really different part of the
Mm.
world. There were, as I said, like there's a lot of expenses involved in it as well. Finding a new job in
Yeah.
a market where you know nobody and have no contacts really, very
Mm.
difficult. Particularly as a foreigner, I then needed to be sponsored by my new workplace.
Okay.
And yeah, it was really my first experience of living somewhere where I wasn't a citizen. And that
Mm.
has given me a much greater understanding of what that experience feels like, the kind of constraints that are placed on you, particularly in terms of employment. To be honest, I probably wasn't as aware of as I would have liked to be before I went through that experience myself. Yeah, for all those challenges, I wouldn't trade it for the world. I'm so
Mm.
grateful I've had this experience of now living outside of Australia for six
Yeah.
years.
It definitely enriches you, this experience. Even just the journey of making that move and setting up a new life somewhere. And as you mentioned, the culture shock. Because I think for you, because I'm based in Italy, I think most of my listeners are, I know. But coming from the UK, I moved to Germany and then eventually to Italy. Like that was already difficult. And the cultures are different, but it's always still in Europe. So there
Mhm.
are a lot of similarities in terms of culture and how people live. The further south you go, the bigger the differences become, as I've noticed. But I think also with the European Union at the time, obviously now it's changed politically, but at the time it was easier for me to move because I could just like rock up in Germany, set up a life without really having to go through probably the process you went through of visas and getting sponsored and things like that. So I imagine that was challenging, and also I think the cultural differences are bigger. I imagine, I don't know, I've never visited that part of the world, but from Australia to Singapore and then eventually Thailand, I imagine the cultures are very different.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot of differences there, and I think educating myself on those differences was
Mm.
really, really important. And I
Yeah.
think a lot of us think, particularly in UX research, that we're really sort of empathetic operators and we're really people, and that's gonna be enough. And
Yeah.
like that's a great starting point that
Mm.
you're curious about people, you're deeply
Yeah.
invested in them and want to build those kind of relationships. But I think doing some more kind of reading and self-education on what some of the friction I was encountering to kind of give it
Mm.
a name and have a framework to discuss it and kind of come to terms with my own culture. Because
Yeah.
frankly, I think I didn't really understand Australian culture until I left the
Oh,
country. Because when you are
interesting.
part of the cultural majority, I think your ability to kind of see it and talk about it and
Mm.
articulate it can be a bit more limited than I realized at least. And when I left, I kind of had these moments of coming to terms with who am I? Like how much of myself is based on my culture? How much of it is my personality? Like this sounds really meta, and in some ways it really is. And I actually feel similar having left Singapore now. I feel like I'm coming to terms with more of the elements of the Singaporean culture now that I'm out of
Like
it.
you.
You can see it a little bit more kind of in contrast to where you're living at the moment. I would say though, one of the things that made like going to Singapore super easy is the language. So English is the language that's spoken in Singapore. It's the language of business, language of government. So that side of things was definitely really straightforward. Whereas in Thailand, we're coming to terms with a new language and a new alphabet. So
Oh,
you really have no starting point to read a Thai word unless you speak Thai. And that has been really, really fascinating. To be functionally illiterate is really mind blowing. And you can totally get by with English. I live in Bangkok. It's the capital. It's very like cosmopolitan. If you just spoke English, would be fine for most of the time. But yeah, I can't read advertisements. I can't read certain instruction manuals. I can't read my electricity bill. Slowly, I'm getting better. I'm really making an effort. I go to Thai class. But yeah, it's a whole new experience. I've never had that before. And really like living somewhere long term where you don't
yeah.
speak the language or where you're learning the language, I should say, is definitely a different experience.
Yeah, it kind of gives you that kind of tying it in with research design and such. It gives you that eye opener of what it's like to just completely not understand something and have to, or have maybe a disability or something that prevents you from being able to understand something as maybe other people would understand it. And that those difficulties and those steps you have to go through to be able to survive or to accomplish the tasks that you want to do. So I suppose it enriches that side of your life too, which is what I want to tie it into now. So how have all these experiences helped you in your career? This moving abroad, adapting to new cultures, language, etc. Have you seen any things that you can take away and apply to your role, to your job, or even your company now?
Definitely, definitely. I think a big one for me is starting to really think quite critically about the role that culture plays in UX research as a practice. Frankly, I think this is under discussed, and a lot of the techniques that are taught as part of the UX research practice are taught as acultural when they aren't, because folks from different cultures are going to behave really differently when you're sitting down with them for a 1 hour interview or for an ethnographic session or for a usability test. Folks are going to have different ways that they sort of present themselves, their opinions, their views, their thoughts within that session.
Mm,
And I have really tried to kind of deconstruct this and think about it more. I read a really fantastic book called The Culture Map by Erin Mayer, which I would recommend to everyone. I can send you info about it
oh yeah.
after the episode as well. And in it, she talks about all these different cultural dimensions. And she is like a business person and a business academic, I guess. So she applies them all to business context, which is super helpful. And I was able to take some of these ideas and these frameworks and think about how they actually apply to UX research as a practice. So one of the ones that I think is really important is this dimension called context. So different cultures are what's called high context versus low context. High context cultures tend to be more about reading in between the lines. They tend to be more about things like metaphor. Folks don't tend to be as direct, whereas low context cultures tend to be very direct. People say exactly what they mean when they mean it, and there's not really that much room for interpretation. The archetypical kind of high context culture is Japan, where I think they say you have to read the air. And one of the lowest context cultures is the US, where people are very direct. And I think an example of this, and like, I don't know if this is validated, is in the US, people say like eyeglasses, horseback riding, tuna fish. Like the
Sure.
tuna could only be a fish, the glasses are only on your eyes, and you only ride the back of the horse. Like there's just no room to interpret any of those things
Oh,
at
so even within
differently.
the language, like the
Yes.
adaptations from British to American English as well.
100%, 100%. So the
Interesting.
US is like very, very low context. Australia is also low context, but slightly less. And the UK is a bit more towards
More
the high
towards.
context side of things again. Singapore, I think, is one of the lower context
Okay.
Southeast Asian cultures. However, as an Australian, I would still find that high context. So it's a lot about understanding where you and your kind of cultural where you sit on this spectrum, right, compared to where you're doing research. So it's not so much about trying to understand cultures in an absolute sense, but really trying to understand relationally. You showing up in this engagement as someone who's likely to find it more high context than you're used to, or you're likely to find it more low context than you're used to. So for me, right, I'm generally going to find most things more high context than I'm used to when I'm doing work in Southeast Asia. How I think this shows up in UX research is folks are much less likely to be outrightly like critical of your design in a really specific way if you're doing something like a usability test. So I would get quite sort of confused, to be honest, when I would do some research in Singapore, and I would hear things like, people might be confused by this. And what you're taught to do as a UX researcher in that instance is say, well, I'm not really interested in what other people might think. I want to know your opinion. And I really had time to reflect on this and think, should I be saying that? Because I think what that participant is saying to me is, it's confusing. But I think they're just saying it to me in a different way that I can't really pick up on because of how I speak English and how I kind of read the world. And it was just a really interesting.
British, I would say.
Yeah,
The term beating around the bush, I would say in this case is kind of what that person was doing, and like kind of tying in with what you mentioned, that they wanted to tell you something in their cultural way, which is super.
Right, exactly. And then the kind of flip side to this, if you're a more high context person operating in a more low context environment, you might find that things sound more negative than they are, because low context folks might be like, this doesn't make sense, that's not clear, that's confusing. And a low context person probably just thinks they're being really clear and showing exactly where their errors are. But that might come across as being very, very critical in a different cultural context. So understanding yourself, where you sit and how you perceive these things, and then thinking about what's likely to come out in these sessions, I think is also really important. And obviously, folks are from all over the world. We all have so many different things that mean we show up in different ways in an interview session. So we should never be, of course, like stereotyping or drawing like really broad brushstrokes. But it's an important thing to start considering these cultural dimensions, how they impact you as an individual, how they might impact your practice. Because I think with that consideration, we're much more likely to get more richness out of our sessions.
Yeah, that's really cool, and that's kind of blown my mind this morning. So thank you for sharing that. It's super interesting.
I've got more.
Hit me. I'm waiting. No, it was super interesting to hear that, because I was kind of relating it to my own life as well. And because I would consider now, after what you've told me, that Italy is is it low context when they're more direct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so Italian culture is very direct. So this new term I've learned, low context. And I've even noticed how within like family members, like my wife's Italian and obviously their family's Italian. And that's been something that my time being here, like as you mentioned before, that it can come across as being maybe hypercritical or more negative, when in reality they're just pointing out and just being direct in their communication style. And that can be interpreted as being negative or hypercritical. Applying that to research is really interesting, and it's changed the way I look at things. So thanks for sharing that. And I'll wait for this book you're going to share with me.
Yes, it's a really fantastic book. And there are a lot of other dimensions that we could talk about their application to UX research as well.
Absolutely. We'll have to do another full episode just on that. Cool. I actually now wanted to move into your company, Rex. So how did that come about? You mentioned obviously at the beginning of the episode that this is kind of a new venture. So it's been open 13, 14 months. So why did you want to set this up? Because before that, what were you doing? Just so obviously our listeners can understand what that transition was like for you, and what was the catalyst, because you mentioned you've never done this before, so why did you want to do it now?
So the job that I held prior to starting my company was in-house UX research. So that's what I was doing before. That job ended quite suddenly with a layoff, something that I think many of us experienced over the past couple of years. There's always people to bond with. So after I lost my job, after I was laid off, I just applied for new jobs, and I really thought I was just going to go out and get a job. I think I had my first job interview like 3 days later. Like I was straight back into it, which in retrospect may have been me being in a little bit of denial about what had just happened, but we all go through things in our own ways, and that was my coping mechanism. So I was just out. I was applying for jobs. I was having interviews, doing my CV, doing all the things, and as part of the layoff, I wrote on LinkedIn that I'd lost my job. And I think that's really common. A lot of us do it. We share what we're going through. And I posted that I got laid off. And then I posted another post about job hunting. And then I started writing a little bit about actual content to do with UX research. And one of those posts was about putting a dollar value on the impact that UX research creates. I'd never seen anyone do that before. And it was a skill that I had because I came from management consulting where we do that kind of thing all the time. This kind of market sizing, impact sizing, financial modeling. I'm by no means a world expert, but like I can get by. And I just was like, I know I was creating all of this impact. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to calculate how much one study could generate in terms of cost savings or revenue improvements or whatever for an organization. So I wrote it out and a lot of people resonated with it. It did extremely well. And down the bottom, I just wrote, I'm thinking about running a course on this. If anyone's interested, let me know. And the comments just went crazy. And I thought, okay, interesting. Like there's definitely demand for this. And so then I made a little wait list, got like 100 people signing up for it. I ran a free one and there were still people being like, when's the next one? When's the next one? I thought, okay, I need to start monetizing this. Yeah. And this is where the intersection with being overseas really happens. So if you want to like, the visa situation when you're overseas is like more complicated. And my understanding of it at the time was like, you can't make money from more than one employer in Singapore. Like if you're on an employment pass, you're employed by your employer and that's it. And if you want to make like money on the side, I thought I needed to start a company. Like you can't freelance if you don't have a work visa, and you can't really get a work visa to freelance if you're overseas. Like it's all just very complicated. So I was like, okay, I need to start a company. And that felt really big and really official to me. And I thought, if I'm starting a company, why don't I just start a company? Like if I'm doing the paperwork,
I'm going to do it.
Let's go all in. And so, yeah, the little bit of like teaching, that was really the first thing. And because I've been a consultant for many years, I know how to do that. Like I know how to write a proposal. I know how to win business. I know how to deliver work as an agency. Why don't I just do that?
Yeah, I've already got all the skills and the experience to do that. Just make it formal now.
Exactly. So it was this experience, I think, of like testing and iterating in public on LinkedIn has been really instrumental to my business. I still do it. That's how I develop most of my educational content, is through running little kind of experiments, if you like, through my LinkedIn content. I'm seeing what's resonating, what are people interested in, what are the strong signals. And if those strong signals are there, then I go through the product development process, essentially. So I have these like B2C offerings that I really enjoy running, and I'm still developing more of them. And then I also do the consulting side where I work with organizations as well, doing like UX research projects or doing training in-house. So it was honestly, like a little bit of serendipity, a lot of encouragement from people in my personal life, from partner, from friends, etc., being like, you can do this, you're going to be great at it. And I really can't, I think, underplay how important having that network is. And I think also, like, I really want to acknowledge kind of my privilege in this moment as well, that I have my husband has a full-time job, he has a salary, so that the financial risk was less for me doing this compared to someone who, for example, is like sole income earner with dependents. Like it's really not the same thing. And I just never want to kind of lionize the choice that I was free to make, that I fully acknowledge like not everyone else is free to make. Like I'm very, very lucky that I had the opportunity to take this kind of bet and to experiment like this. I feel really, really lucky that I got to do that.
Of course. Yeah, everyone has different circumstances. Also, I think the country where you live, the society, the level of society you're from, it's not your choice in most cases. And unfortunately, it can limit people's choices in what they can do for employment, etc. Like just for example, here in Italy, it's very difficult to set up as a freelancer, because even if you earn €5, that's taxed compared to I don't know how it is in Thailand, etc. But whereas in the UK, you've got a limit on how much you can earn that's not taxed, and then the rest on top of that is taxed. So at least you can start off small and kind of grow without that worry of, I'm going to have to, I don't know, because taxes here are very high in Italy, like 45%. So if you earn €5, I don't know, €2.50 almost is already on taxes. So it can be very hard to start out. So I know a lot of also UX researchers here that find it tough to freelance and look for in-house work. So yeah, it's nice also you mentioned that as well. Sometimes you can look at people on social media or on LinkedIn and think, oh, I wish I can do that, but my circumstances don't allow. But then it makes you feel that maybe you're not good enough or you can't do that. So it's always good to kind of reflect on that. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Definitely.
But I'm really happy for you and that you're able to do that as well. Also, just to get a bit more insight, because you touched on what Rex does, but is it just do you perform research? Is it something that you do the normal research work as well as consulting, as well as kind of providing these courses? Did I understand correctly?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay.
So yeah, when I talk about the consulting work, mainly that work will be doing projects with a strong UX research component. So they might be sort of purely UX research, or UX research might be part of like the broader project that we're doing. I know
Okay.
like our industry in general, we use a lot of jargon inconsistently, and it makes things really, really difficult. And I know folks even have different definitions of things like consulting versus freelance, like, but
Yeah.
they're really just the same thing. For me, like freelance is just someone who's on their own and they're just winning work for themselves with
Yeah.
no sort of aspirations, I guess, to grow beyond that. To me, that's the definition of freelance. And to
Okay.
me, when I talk about like my agency, like the reason I say I'm building an agency is because my ambition is
Mm,
to grow. So we
okay.
have one employee, I'm hiring a second one.
Oh,
Like
wow.
I want to have a presence in
Mm,
every market in Southeast Asia.
awesome.
I want to grow my firm. I want to grow the influence. And so that's why I've always talked about building an agency from day
Yeah.
one rather than freelancing. Also, for me, like I've called the company Rex rather than like Ruby's company. I want it to grow beyond myself.
Yeah.
I really want it to be something that I can have others at, the whatever we call the most senior level at my company, TBC, and they can be with clients, they can be winning business. And so we can really scale and we can really grow. Like I've had ambitions from day one and I talk about them in that way. I think you've got
That's
to
good.
paint yourself a picture.
No, 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 absolutely. Obviously, that can evolve as well for someone who's freelancing, can eventually look, I can grow this, change approach, etc. But yeah, that's super cool. That also thanks for the definition as well. And that's why I asked that question because, like you say, depending on where you are in the world and your background, and there is a lot of jargon. So I always find it good to make sure it's clear and understandable for everyone because I know some of our listeners are entering the field, so maybe some of these terminologies are also new. So it's good for them also to learn these terminologies from the ground up. But that's cool. We're coming towards the end of the recording, but I wanted to ask you, because I always like to end on this kind of tone. Is there some advice that you would like to share to our listeners or thinking early career or someone that's thinking of entering the field? And this could be something that maybe someone else has told you in the past when you were a new little UX researcher, or maybe it could just be something that you've learned yourself over the years and you'd like to share. So yeah, is there anything you would like to leave our listeners? Sorry to
I
put you
think,
on the spot.
no, I think it's a great question. I think what I would say is that the jobs we will be doing 10 years from now might not exist yet. So the reason I didn't become a UX researcher straight out of university is that the job didn't really exist.
Yeah.
So I recently went back and looked at Google Trend data over the course of my career for the term
Mm,
UX researcher. And
mhm.
when I started at university, the line is at zero. So no one's even
Yeah.
searching it on Google. It doesn't actually exist. By the
Mm,
time I started my first job, I think the line is at like 2 or 3 out of 100. And by
okay.
the time I became a UX researcher, which was nearly 10 years later, it was super well known. The
Mm,
line has skyrocketed
yeah.
on Google. And my mum actually always used to say this to me that the job you will do in the future probably doesn't
Yeah.
exist yet.
True.
And I think, I studied liberal arts, majoring in psychology, like a degree that I think a lot of people, to be honest, almost laughed at and said, like, you'll
Mm.
never find a job with a degree like that. But I
Thinking
think my
enough.
degree has come, yeah, people really can have strong thoughts about humanities. I'm a massive advocate. And I
Oh,
think
no,
my
I love
degree has really set me up well for this kind of ability to engage critically with the world around me, to be a systems
Mm,
thinker, to
yeah.
write really well, to write really strongly. Like these are
Mm,
really important skills that will see us through. So I guess my advice to folks earlier in their career is to keep your options open and
yeah.
to really be happy to do very different things. Like my first job was in market research consulting. Like I then became a management consultant, then became a UX
Mm,
researcher. Like we talk about, millennials and younger having so many different jobs
yeah.
in their career. So I feel like I never really had my heart set on one particular option.
Mm,
And in many ways that was very freeing because then I
yeah.
had options to just try out different things, learn lots of different skills and build my career together. And Yeah, you don't need a very specific goal, I don't think. I think you can
No.
have an open like sense of where you're going, and there's
Yeah.
a lot of magic that can happen in between there.
Absolutely, yeah. That's really good advice, especially now with well, it's always changing, but the changing landscape, and now with AI and things like this. And as you say, like roles pop up here and there, and roles develop and change. Remember, the name of the role that you're doing now will be different in 5, 10 years time, even if it's generally the same thing you're doing day in, day out. So yeah, I think that's really good. And especially now with the layoffs and things like that, I think not limiting yourself to a job title and being open, offering your skills in different areas of business, different areas of tech. So that can open different doors and different avenues. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for coming on to the podcast. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot myself, so I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot, and it's just been a pleasure to talk with you, Ruby. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Dale. I'm really glad we could do this.
No problem. Hopefully we can get you on in the future again if you've got time.
Sounds good.